Welcome back to State of the Division, a UFC commentary channel, I guess the best way to call this. And here we are with UFC 281. It's actually somewhat of an interesting card. I will admit the main fight on this card is very much a UFC hype train, but maybe it works out interesting. We don't actually know. But we're going to start off by breaking everything down like we always do. We got the 6-1 Carlos Blackjack Olberg looking to keep rolling against the 13-1 Negumereanu. I said that wrong. 4 inches go to Olberg, who is also 3 years older. Now, I don't have a lot on Olberg. I do have stuff that paints a pretty concise picture. He's got a striking differential of 8.91 landed, 3.95 absorbed, combined with 4 career knockouts. It's definitely a killer be killed kind of fighter. He does tend to take these striking leads in his fights, which tells me he always puts this pressure on from the get-go. However, against Kennedy Nzechukwu, I'm so sorry, he was leading 146-82 and lost to a KO finish. So he certainly constantly pours it on, leaving himself open. Negumereanu is literally the complete opposite, however. A striking differential of 3.79 landed to a 5.69 absorbed. Does have a good run of knockouts, 2 in the UFC, 8 total. But consistently he ends up behind on strikes, and he tends to rely on takedowns a bit more, averaging about 1 a fight. It's not to say either fighter's bad, but this is a close one based on how few fights they both have and giving me data to look at. Vegas does like Olberg, and I'm going to agree, though this fight could kind of go either way. Olberg is aggressive off the cuff and does have a 100% takedown defense. That's something that Negumereanu really relies on to get going a lot of fights, is that takedown. So if Olberg stuffs and just pours it on like he tends to do, Nikolai is going to have to try to fight back with a late round knockout. It's only happened once to Olberg. Maybe it happens again, but I like Olberg striking over Nikolai's here. 18-5, Julio Arce looks to get a streak going against 11-2 Montel Quick Jackson. That's quick without a C. Jackson is 3 years younger, 3 inches shorter, gives up 5 in reach. Now, Arc is a weird one to look at. Stats are decent. 4.74 landed, 3.08 absorbed. It's not great, but it's decent. And a takedown average of 0.42, which tells me it's more of a situational takedown game. He's this awkward killer bee decision kind of fighter. I'm going to knock you out, or I'm going to lose in the decision. He's only got 1 loss that's a finish in the UFC, and 3 career decision losses. He's not an early round finisher either. Only 3 of his 9 UFC fights ending in the second. The rest going into the third. So he tends to try to drag you out more, get you into those later rounds. Jackson's a little less weird. Still in the UFC, he's been a bit more of a grinder, making use of adequate striking, 3.42 to 1.34, and occasionally getting some knockout power going. It has not been there in the UFC, though. Takedown game has been really consistent, however, and pretty effective with a 4.13 average and the occasional ability to go through with submissions. Now, Vegas here likes Jackson. I'm going to agree. I do think Arc has a chance, but given how Jackson drags fights out and grinds with takedowns, I do think his takedown game gives him the edge here. Obviously, if Arc can get the finish going, I think he has it, but with his tendency to get decisioned, I think this goes to Jackson. Now, this fight may or may not be in the wrong spot. Sherdog has it listed here, but the UFC Stats page has it listed farther up for some reason. 9-3-1, Matt the Steamroller, Frevola, that's Steamroller with an A, looks to get his groove back against the 13-0 Atman Bulldozer Azaitar. I said that wrong. Frevola is either 1 or 2 inches taller because UFC and Sherdog can agree, but even height and even reach either way. Sorry, even age and even reach. I don't know why I wrote even height twice. Now, Frevola is a grinder. He has one of many on this card. He's got an almost dead even striking percentage, a 3.43 to 3.47, and only has 2 career KOs, and 1 of those is in the UFC. So his strong point is, unsurprisingly, his takedown and ground game, which still makes me really wish that was a stat. He averages 2.47, but even in fights without takedowns, he can still get ground control time. However, against other grapplers, this can get flipped on him. We see in the Sarkian fight, I'm so sorry, he was taken down 10 times that round. Not sure this matters, since Azaitar seems to be a striker and finisher through and through, 10 career KO wins, 2 in his last 2 UFC fights. And in the UFC, he's very much led every fight in terms of striking and has got gotten first round finishes multiple times. Now, Vegas kind of screws me here and has these two fighters both on the negatives. Ottman's the slight favorite, 115 to 105, but I'm going to do my kind of bias here, and I'm going to default to the wrestler and go with Frevola. I don't think we've seen Azaitar fight somebody that wrestles like Frevola and does this hardcore grind you to oblivion. And while Frevola's striking ain't great, he's proven that he can hang in. This fight can go either way. I am going to give the edge to Frevola here. 9-3, Michael Lone Wolf Trizano tries to get back to winning against 10-5, Sung Woo, Sting Choi. Only difference being 3 inches in reach to Choi. Trizano has been a little hit or miss in the UFC, but stat-wise, he seems to be a control-based fighter, whether that's based on takedowns or just reversing positions. Striking is at best functional, 3.45 to a 4.34, and even his takedowns aren't that high, a 0.38 average. And honestly, Choi's a bit of the same. Outside the UFC, he has had more finishes. Inside, they haven't been there. Striking's 3.32 to 3 flat with a 0.90 to his takedowns. He does tend to stack his takedown when he gets them, but he's also very takedownable with multiple fighters securing 3 or more against him. Now in this fight, I'm looking at 2 fighters coming off back-to-back losses. Vegas likes Choi, and I can kind of see why. His striking is better. It's not saying much here. And that 0.90 to takedowns, he has had some good fights. I am going to take a shot and go with Trizano here. He likes the control game, seems capable of reversing ground position, and I think this sort of grindy control style is going to neutralize a lot of what Choi has going for him. But we are finally out of the early prelims. 13-7, Carolina Kowalkiewicz, nope, looks to prove that she can win against 11-4 Silvana La Movada Gomez Juarez. Literally no differences between these two in any category here. To explain my entry for this fight, Carolina's coming off a win over Felice Herrig after losing 5 straight. To be fair, they are 5 straight against a lot of contenders, so it's definitely a must-win in order to get a streak going, however. She's almost the textbook definition of a grinder. Striking's dead even, 5.38 to 5.59. I don't know why I said 5.39 there. And a super low takedown average, 0.18. In her recent fight, she's definitely been outclassed, getting outstruck significantly, and when it isn't that, she's getting taken down and wrestled into oblivion. Juarez is a similar situation, with this only being her 4th UFC fight, where she's won a single one so far. On that note, I can't get a read, aside from the fact her ground game isn't good, and she's lost 2 in a row to submission. Both actually by armbar, which is weird because I figured you'd defend that a lot harder the second time around. This is another fight where Vegas doesn't give me my easy way out. I am going to go with Carolina. She hasn't won a lot recently, but her losses are all against contenders where she's put up fights. Yes, she's lost badly. Yes, she's lost convincingly. But her quality of competition that she's faced has been higher than the quality of competition I've seen Juarez place. Do I think Juarez can win? Yes. Am I going to pick Juarez? No. I just think Carolina here has proven a little bit more to me. And I think that her kind of grinding takedowns, her grinding kind of, it's weird because it's like I know she can take stuff down. I know she can handle the ground a little bit. But against Juarez, I've seen this submission game. And I feel like the grinding striking is going to give Carolina the edge here. Well, after that messy sort of segue, we're done with the early prelims. They're interesting. I think there's a few potential fights here. I think a few fighters are fighting to see if they get cut or stay on. I think both Sungwoo and Trizano are fighting for contracts. I think Carolina's fighting to see if she actually can make us run in this division. I don't understand. Well, Frevola may or may not be the early prelims. I think he might supposed to be the headliner according to UFC stats. I don't understand why those two websites can't agree. But the early prelims have a few interesting fights that we're looking to see if people can get stuff going or if they're going to stay in the UFC for much longer. They're worth checking out. Moving on to the actual prelims now. 8-1 Andre Petrovski looks to keep rolling as the 18-5 Wellington the Prodigy Turman. It's a bit of an unearned title. Turman is 5 years younger, no other measurements actually mattering. Now, Petrovski is very much a finisher on both sides of the game. 4 submission, 4 KO. Striking is dominant so far, 4.07 to 2.05. I will say his best striking performance did have him with 48% of ground strikes. Does kind of lead into his rather dominant ground game, rocking a 4.10 takedown average and submission attempts galore when he does land those takedowns. Turman's a bit different, especially since he shows up more as a grinder despite a submission threat and create submission wins. Hasn't been major in the UFC. He's landed a few, but just hasn't been a consistent thing with him. Striking is negligible, 2.96 landed, 4.4 absorbed. It's not great. Now, 2 of his 3 UFC losses also came by KO, so it's not straight up that he's a walking tank, it's also that he is mortal in a sense. He doesn't quite have the immortal iron chin that some fighters do. Now, when it comes to Vegas, they like Petrovski here. I'm going to follow, even if it's a bit bland. I think Turman could do something, but I'm looking at Petrovski. We're seeing him being able to turn it on the feet. We're seeing him have success on the ground. And I think that means he can match Turman on the ground, which is his strength. And if he can outpace him on the feet, that's just going to be game over, man. 9-1, Aaron Cold-Blooded Blanchfield looks to keep it rolling against 13-4, Molly Meatball McCann, who wins worst ring name so far. Blanchfield is 9 years younger and takes 4 in reach. Alright, Blanchfield's only got 3 UFC fights, but she looks pretty dominant so far. Striking is especially rock solid, 5.69, 2.50. Doesn't seem to have a knockout power or finishes in general, but the pressure comes in spades. Takedown game is also terrifyingly consistent with a 3.99 average so far, and with the only fight without a takedown ending with her submitting her opponent. Because of course, shows that she can play out of position, off a back, or steal positions. McCann's a bit more of a finisher, 2 in her last 3 and 6 career KO TKO finishes. That being said, she's basically a grinder outside of those 2 fights, with every single one going the distance in her career. It's not indicative that she's bad, that's just a statement of fact. Now, Vegas likes Blanchfield by a lot, and I'm going to agree even though it's boring. I'm doing this based on how well she's applied pressure on the feet and how well her good takedown game has showed up. McCann has struggled with the takedown game in the past. She only has a 46% takedown defense, and if someone like Blanchfield lives up to what we've seen her do so far against an opponent who has some more experience, I think we're going to see McCann on the ground a bit more with Blanchfield on top. 12-3, Dominic the Devastator Reyes steps in to try to rebound against the 20-7 Ryan Superman Spann. Inch in height and 2 in reach going to Reyes. Reyes is a solid heavyweight, Reyes is a solid light heavyweight. I want to say that now because I know 3 losses in a row look bad, but all of those are to the champion or soon to be champion. With that out of the way, his bread and butter is striking and power. 4.77 landed, 3.73 absorbed. Not great, but power is his equalizer here. And that's par for the course with a lot of these heavier weight classes. He does have a takedown game. It's inconsistent, and effectiveness is up in the air, honestly. Spann is a bit different in terms of style. He rocks a 3.34 and 3.41 landed to absorbed, which take a guess what that means then. And he does have power. It's not something he relies on or trusts all that much. Instead, as you probably could have guessed from that, he's a ground-focused fighter with 12 career submission wins. He also doesn't seem to need the takedown to take ground control with only a 1.50 average, which tells me he can play off his back or switch position really well. Now, Vegas likes Reyes, and this is honestly agonizing for me. I want to go my ground bias and pick Spann, kind of playing on the fact Reyes has 3 losses, but I'm going to pick Reyes based on the knockout power and just the survivability he's had against other ground fighters he's faced. He was taken down twice by Jones, managed to make it out of that fight. He fought Jiri Prochazka, survived the takedown, got up, got knocked out. Spann can be dangerous, and maybe he finishes this on the ground, but Reyes has got the power, and I'm going to go towards that here. This might be a poor decision. Ending off these prelims. 10-3, Brad Quake Riddell wins best ring name so far, tries to bounce back in 16-5-1, Renato Moicano Carneiro, who's listed as Renato Moicano on the UFC stats page, and Sherdog listed as his ring name. I don't know. Riddell is 2 years younger, 4 inches shorter, but only gives up an inch in reach. Riddell in the UFC has been a grinder. He just dominates his fights. His last win giving him an 89-73 striking lead with 5 takedowns, only 2 minutes and 30 seconds ground control, but if you land 5, it tends to look really good to the judges. Striking is good enough to get the job done, 4.73 to a 3.56. Again, it's not spectacular, but it more than gets the job done, lets him hang in there, and lets him use his takedowns. And his takedowns are always a reliable threat. I will say he does have 5 KOs outside the UFC. None of those have shown up so far in the UFC. Now, Carnerio, or Moicano, is a bit more of a ground-based finisher. 5 submissions in the UFC, 9 total in his career. He has been susceptible to getting finished, with all but one of his UFC losses coming that way. But his striking is about dead even, with a 4.8 to 4.07, which tells you about that heavy ground focus. This is another close one for me. Vegas likes Moicano here, and I'm going to agree. I agonized over this for far too long just because fighters like Riddell are always difficult to pick against just because that they always have ugly split decision wins. Now, and honestly, this should be a super close fight considering how they both seem to enjoy working the ground. I just think the aggressiveness of Moicano might give him the edge either in the judge's eyes or in regards to a finish here. Finally, starting off our main card after a really solid prelim card. 21-12, Dan the Hangman Hooker looks to rebound against the surging 12-2 Claudio, the Prince of Peru, Puelles. Puelles is 6 years younger, 1 inch shorter, and loses 3 in reach. Hooker is a high-octane striker who relies on pulling you into the phone booth and lighting you up. Clearly seen with his 4.91 landed and 4.81 absorbed. And while he does have KO power, it has not won him a UFC fight since 2019. So besides being a technical striker, he does have a decent takedown game, a .89 average. I know I tend to change what decent defines as, but when a person who has that striking percentage and that type of win has a .89, it counts as a decent. And he does tend to stack them when he gets them. Puelles is not that at all. 1.99 landed to 2.8 unabsorbed, and only 2 career KO wins proves that clearly. He instead excels on the ground game with a 2.74 takedown average with a great submission threat, or at least a knee bar threat in the UFC. He's got 2 of those. He often has takedowns in his fights, and there's even ones where he doesn't, but he gets the submission without a true takedown anyway, meaning that the threat is not just based on when he has control. It's on that split second where he can get the grip he needs and crank it as he needs it, which is always dangerous to see. Vegas likes Hooker, which is hard to say out loud, but I'm actually going to go against this one on a pure gut feeling. Hooker struggled with powerful takedowns before. Islam Makhachev put him on the ground and submitted him. Do I think Puelles is Islam Makhachev? No. But Puelles also doesn't need a true takedown to get his grappling going. So I think Puelles has a shot if he can survive the initial striking thing, if he can get Hooker on the ground, take control, get his submission going against the cage, or take the position he wants off the bat. I think Puelles has got a pretty good shot here. 24-10-1, Frankie the Answer Edgar takes on 18-4-1, Chris El Guapo Gutierrez. Gutierrez is 10 years younger, 3 inches taller, and somehow gives up an inch in reach. Edgar is a long-standing veteran of the UFC who fought literally every big name in the 135 division. And I honest to God forgot he fought and beat Charles Oliveira in 2013. As a result, he's got a good mix of stats and a pretty flexible game. 3.79 to a 2.81 landed with a takedown average of 2.30. Obviously, you see a lot more takedowns in his game as he uses them to gain control or gain ground and pound, but that's sort of as his game is. I consider that a very well-rounded game, able to hang on the feet or use the ground to his advantage. As of late, as in his 2021 win, he's been more of a grinder, keeping it relatively close in the striking, getting takedowns to supplement the points. Gutierrez is honestly similar, but significantly more dynamic. 4.69 to a 2.61 landed being a big part of his offense, where he can pour it on big time for striking leads. He is inconsistent with his takedowns, but it is part of his repertoire, and I think you have to look at that with a little bit of respect. Now, Vegas likes Gutierrez, I'm going to agree. It's nothing against Edgar, but the 10-year age difference, plus the dynamic ability that Gutierrez has, tips it in his direction. They're both very similar, but that age and dynamic ability that Gutierrez has just gives him the edge in my mind. For the last event before the title fights. 28-7-0-1. Dustin the Diamond Poirier looks to get back the title challenging against the
submission record. Great position.
Poirier being 3 years younger and 1 inch taller and taking 1 in reach. Poirier is a well-rounded fighter making use of both sides of the game. A really solid striking setup, 5.61 landed, 4.28 absorbed, what lets him keep up pace with opponents at his worst, and oftentimes he can call up his power to put his opponents down. Takedowns are also incredibly effective with a 1.44 average, and in a lot of his wins, you'll see one takedown he uses to either recover or disrupt his opponent. And honestly, I'll say Chandler is similar. Obviously, it's not the same. He's got less fights in the UFC, and he's coming off fights in Bellator. but he has a 5.17 to a 4.87 absorbed, a takedown average of 1.83. The numbers, well, never mind, the takedown average ain't quite the same, but you get what I drift. He has a surprising amount of power and toughness that he makes use of whenever he can, plus he's got a shocking amount of explosiveness, and he's able to use his frame very well. Going back to his Tony Ferguson fight, which, yes, it was Tony Ferguson who's not had the greatest run lately. Nobody saw an upkick coming from that guy. He's willing to sell out for fights, for strikes, and do what it takes. Now, I am going to go with Poirier, who is the biggest favorite. I think his skill set is super solid. I think he has this incredible knowledge of how to go in there and win a lot of fights. I also refuse to count Chandler out of this fight because he has a surprising amount of explosiveness, surprising amount of ability, and he always makes his fights fun. Which, honestly, this might be my favorite fight on the card for no other good reason. Moving on to the first championship of the night. 20-6, or 19-6 according to Sherdog, Carla Cookie Monster Esparza looks to keep her belt against the 22-3 Welly Magnum Zhang. Zhang being 2 years younger, 3 inches taller, and dead even reach. Esparza is a ground-heavy fighter. I mean, she's got a 2.2 landed, 2.59 absorbed, and a 3.25 takedown average. I think that sums it up pretty well. This comes together for a very dangerous, grinding fighting style you see a lot in this division, and because she's able to move in and get pressure while making you watch out and respect her takedown game, she kind of demands your attention. I will say she has been stuffed consistently before, and especially in that Rose fight where she went 2 for 11 for 22 seconds of ground control. To be fair, that fight was an outlier in every regard, but the point still stands. Welly is more of a striker, often able to bring her power out to put fighters away. Does tend to exchange a little bit more with a 5.78 to a 4.26, but she's got a solid chin and people are definitely wary of her striking. Takedown game is solid, and she uses it regularly to get good control, but it's not the same as Esparza, who grinds you into oblivion. Vegas is going hard with Welly, and I'm going to follow suit. Welly has great striking, which takes advantage of Esparza's biggest weakness, her striking, and Welly has proven the ability to take control on the ground or survive in some cases. I think Esparza could win, but my last image of Esparza is in that Rose fight, and Rose, it was not a good fight for anybody there. And while Esparza has a great ground game, we've seen her get stuffed before. I think Welly could stuff her and either outpoint her or put her away this fight. But for the main event, the last style bender, 23-1 Israel Adesanya, looks to keep his belt against a blast from his past. In 6-1, Alex Poatan Pereira. Adesanya is 2 years younger and takes an inch of reach here. Now, I think Adesanya's been featured on this little thing 3 times at this point, and I don't really know what else to say. He's a dynamic striker. He works his reach well, his technical aspect well. With a 3.93 landed, 2.67 absorbed, he proves that he's a technical striker super well. And even when he's faced with a heavier striking of like a Jan Blachowicz, he endured it till the end. He survived on the ground, and he's proven that he can survive in every aspect of the game. And I know people give him crap for his big mouth, and I'm part of that as well, where if you're going to talk the talk, I kind of want you to walk the walk. But never in my life am I going to deny this man is a spectacular MMA fighter. Pereira, on the other hand, has a much smaller sample size for me to look at, and he's been able to work his power a lot more than Adesanya has. He's got a 6.2 now landed, 3.36 absorbed, but also has the same kind of dynamic striking style. It makes sense with a background in kickboxing. That being said, he has only had 3 fights, and he hasn't quite faced the level of competition Adesanya has, which is just a point to take into consideration. Now, Adesanya is the favorite, I'm going to agree. Sure, Pereira might be able to do it, but based on what I have in MMA, Adesanya has the better resume, has faced much higher competition, and has proven himself again and again to have technical soundness in how to survive different aspects of the game. Could this turn into a kickboxing match? Maybe, but I feel like Adesanya knows he's not going to want to hang there and do that. I think he'll fight smart, he'll work range. I don't imagine a takedown, but I imagine cage clinches and things like that. Obviously, I'm sitting in a chair in a dorm room predicting this. Take it as you will. But UFC 281 is going to be interesting. There are some awesome fights on this card from top to bottom. And I know the early prelims are a bit iffy, but Carlos Olberg and Nicolay, still can't say that last name, both are guys who I remember writing about before, and both look interesting. They got issues, but I think you could see 2 solid fighters come out of that. I will say Frevola is always an interesting fight. He can be good or he can be bad. I never actually know. Moving on, I know for a fact Reyes and Spann should be good just because they're two guys who are both trying to make their way in that division. They're going to put it out there. Riddell Moicano, that should be a solid one. Brad Riddell's a grinder, but he shows up to win, and Moicano's trying to go for it, guys. Hooker Puelles will be interesting. I will admit if it feels like Puelles is getting fed to the wolves here, but I think he can pull it off. It'll tell a lot about that division if he does pull it off. Because if Hooker wins, I think we see Hooker back looking for title contention soon. If Puelles wins, we get a new face in the ring that we might be seeing fight one more time for challenging. Poirier Chandler, honestly, is my favorite fight in this card. Dustin's always great. He brings his A game. Chandler brings everything he's got to every fight he's had. He's honestly probably my favorite losing fighter in the UFC right now. And that's not an indictment of like him being bad. That's just the fact that he's fought Justin Gaethje and Charles Oliveira. Hey, you fought two guys that were the champion and a dude who fought for the championship. Those aren't losses that I think you complain about too much. And even these title fights at least are interesting. I am scared to be interested in the Esparza Zhang fight because I was excited originally for Rose Esparza. And I paid for that and I watched that entire thing. And I think Adesanya Pereira is getting a lot of hype, but I think we need to temper expectations here because I think Adesanya is a smart fighter. He's not going to play a game I think that he doesn't think he can win. That being said, put your opinions down below. Tell me if you followed my advice. I'll probably eventually post how many of these I got right in the next one of these I do. I'm on time for once, so we're taking that with a grain of salt. But thank you for listening. This has been State of the Division, UFC 281. And I'll see you for UFC 282. That one's going to be fun.